Well, we've been at this issue for decades, actually, not just years. So the point you're making is completely correct. Uh, it has been uh, decades that the West, the US and Europe, pushed for Ukraine to be part of the Western alliance. And that has meant NATO membership and European Union membership. And those two distinct clubs have become more and more intertwined over the past 30 years, during which this Ukraine project has been carried out. During this entire period, up until very recently, the United States and Europe were aligned that Ukraine would become part of NATO and that Ukraine would become part of the European Union. This was actually spelled out very clearly by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 in his book, The Grand Chessboard, and also in his article, A Grand Strategy for Eurasia. And he conjoined the two, EU membership and NATO membership, said this is the westward enlargement, and Russia would have to accept it. Well, Russia did not accept it. Russia objected from basically 1991 onward. When this became a real project in the mid-1990s, Russia objected. Russia has objected ever since. And what has been also true is that Ukraine was internally divided over this issue all along. Ukraine itself is a mix of Ukrainian nationalist language, ethnicity in the West, and Russian ethnic populations in the South and the East, the Donbass. And there have been divides of politics and attitudes towards Western alignment along those lines, again, since Ukraine's independence back in 1990, 1991. So this issue has divided Ukraine internally, and it was the cause of war between NATO and Russia already going back now 30 years. What has changed recently is Trump's view, and this is a part of the U.S. security state view, because the U.S. itself is divided inside the security state, but the view that this was a gambit that didn't work. Brzezinski promised back in 1997 it would be costless and painless. Russia wouldn't have any ability to resist. The Biden team, which led the actual war since Russia's escalation in February 2022, thought that Russia would collapse quickly, either on the battlefield or economically or politically. What Trump has understood, and some of those around him, is that this 30-year gambit failed because Russia had said repeatedly this was of existential significance for Russia. This was a core national security issue, and Russia would not relent in preventing NATO enlargement. So this brings us till today. The realistic view of the Trump group right now is that a gambit that was supposed to be low cost, big win failed. It failed over the last basically 30 years, but specifically over the last 11 years, because the U.S. Installed a pro-NATO regime in Ukraine in February 2014, and it was supposed to be a walk in the park after that, that NATO would just enlarge and Russia would back down. So the U.S. is now saying, enough is enough. We have other things to do. We have other interests in the world. We're not in want of further escalation. Our stockpiles are pretty bare after all these years of war and the wars in the Middle East and the risks of war in East Asia. It's time to recognize that this was indeed existential for Russia. It was a a wannabe for the West. It was a game, I would say, for the United States that was supposed to be an easy game, didn't work. So the Trump group wants to end it, cut the losses. The European leaders say no, this war needs to continue. The Ukrainian regime, which is a U.S. installed regime, maybe even more understandably says, no, this war needs to continue. The regime depends completely on the war continuing. Zelensky has no prospect politically as soon as this war ends. It's been a money-making corruption machine in addition to all the other issues. The puzzle for many of us is why the Germans, the French, the British, and by that I don't mean the publics, I mean the small leadership group, are so insistent on fighting a losing battle, which has cost at least 2 million Ukrainian casualties. It's been a disaster. Why they're so interested in continuing that battle. I would say a couple of things about that. One is that their publics are not with them. So Merz, Starmer, and Macron are among the least popular politicians in the whole world. They have no public backing in their own country. Their own countries do not want World War III. They do not want war with Russia. They'd actually like pensions, Social Security, continued decent living standards. They don't want this militarization. So this is not a popular cause in Europe. It is a cause of Merz, Starmer, Macron, and a small group that they represent. Now, what is that cause? I would say most people that look at this closely don't have a good answer, convincing answer to that. Is it that their own political futures are wrapped up in a failed project, and so they can't admit wrong? Is it that they're pawns of the military-industrial complex, both their own and the United States? Is it, when I look at Merz and listen to him, I feel almost like it's a German wanting revenge on Russia for World War II. That may sound a little harsh, but Merz is vulgar. He's a warmonger. He hasn't said one thing about peace since he became chancellor. And his support in Germany is collapsing. So I'm hardly alone in saying that. I'm aligned with the vast majority of the German people, actually, in saying that. So all of this is to say, Glenn, that we're not in a new issue. We're in an issue that's been going on 30 years. During the second Trump term, Trump has repeatedly said, let's stop this war for the reasons I've been saying. Then the Europeans and Zelensky have run in, and Trump has changed his tune, reflecting not only his personal mood swings and high volatility, but also the fact that the U.S. security state is divided. There is the military-industrial complex in the U.S., which is happy to fight on. They're making lots of money. This is a very profitable war for the military contractors, for the senators and congressmen that support the military contractors. So when you ask, is this the end? Logically, it should be, but Trump has backed down each time that he's said to the Russian counterparts, let's end this on the basis of Ukrainian neutrality. And whether he'll back down again is the question. I'm hoping the war will end to save Ukraine from this terrible, mistaken, futile, seemingly perpetual war that has been waged now for well over a decade, and this project that has been waged for 30 years.
Well, the post-Cold War objective of NATO appears to have been to develop a collective hegemony in Europe, that is, to push Russia out of the continent, again, fitting within the unipolar moment. But some of the split you refer to within the U.S., it seems to be that there's a new wing of American politicians who think that the hegemonic aspiration exhausts the United States, and also it prevents the U.S. from adjusting to these multipolar realities. That is, it's getting bogged down in Europe when its priorities in a multipolar world should be to have more influence in the Western Hemisphere, and also they want to confront China in Asia. Not that this is necessarily a great idea, but at least Europe is no longer a priority. So this seems to be splitting the U.S., but also it seems to be where the Europeans get very uncomfortable, because there's not really a clear plan for Europe in the role after unipolarity, that is, after the United States deprioritizes and in Europe and partially leaves the continent. And I'm not sure if this is also the reason why we have this revival in German militarism. But given that this war began as a conflict over the European security architecture, with Ukraine being a symptom of this, to what extent do we need some settlement on what European security should look like? Because we're dealing with this as if it's only an issue about Ukraine, but this war doesn't really have that much to do with Ukraine as opposed to being one component. And also it doesn't really have that much to do with territory either. It doesn't seem like we're dealing with the root of the matter.
That's exactly right. And I think it's important to recognize that this U.S. gambit, the one that Brzezinski spelled out in 1997, was a piece of a larger puzzle. It was the global chessboard. It wasn't just a European issue. The belief in the 1990s in the United States was unipolarity, that there was one global hegemon, that was the United States, and that it was the role of the global hegemon to make sure that it would never be threatened by any pesky wannabes in the future. One part of that was to corner Russia, surrounded in the Black Sea region, basically render Russia a third-rate power or less. Brzezinski openly opined about Russia breaking into a number of weak separate units that would be joined together as some kind of confederacy, not even a federation, but some kind of confederacy of a European Russia, a Siberian Russia, and an Far East Russia. So they were dreaming that the U.S. would run the world, and this is one part of it. And the real dreamers, the delusionists, became known as the neocons. They thought that the U.S. would render Russia into, as I say, a third-rate power, or completely broken, that the U.S. would dominate the Middle East. And that was a big part of the project, especially a Zionist orientation, because the U.S. went to war repeatedly for the sake of Greater Israel, which is so weird and almost unimaginable, but it was part of the neoconservative playbook. And in East Asia, the truth is they didn't have a strategy for China because they're not very intelligent people. They couldn't look ahead, and they didn't see that China was going to rise as a major power. So if you go back to the late 1990s, China barely figures in any of the discussions. It's not like they were plotting what to do. China was a place that was going to assemble our toys and automotive components and electronics gears and phones and things like that. It wasn't a matter of geopolitical concern at the time. So this unipolar project had its European dimension in NATO enlargement. And this, of course, ran contrary to the fundamental alternative vision of European security, which was ostensibly the one that had ended the Cold War. Because remember that the end of the Cold War was German reunification in 1990, based on the 4+2 framework. And the goal of that settlement was indivisible security in Europe, that there would not be blocs. In fact, it was quite explicit of the US and Germany that NATO would not play any kind of strategic bloc role going forward. And the U.S. said to Gorbachev, we will not take advantage of your unilateral ending of the Warsaw Pact military alliance or your economic and financial weakness as of the early 1990s. We will have indivisible security. And several treaties and agreements under the framework of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe defined that kind of indivisible security. NATO was the opposite of that. NATO is bloc politics. The OSCE was the end of bloc politics. I was there in the Soviet Union in 1990 and in Russia from the end of 1991 onward, and I heard an earful from Gorbachev, from Yeltsin, and so forth about a common European home, indivisible security, the end of blocs, peace and cooperation. I believe it. I believed it then. I think that that's the answer to European security. The Europeans are not having it, by the way. This is so strange to my mind. They were offered peace, and they have basically rejected it. First, under the push of the United States, they said, yes, we prefer U.S. hegemony to a common European home. They made that choice. They had qualms and misgivings. Actually, the showdown came at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008 when the U.S. said, now's the moment. We're going to push NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. Chancellor Merkel, President Hollande said, not a great idea. George Bush put his foot down and said, we're going to do it. And they said, okay, we're going to do it. That's when the U.S. Hegemon dominated, and the idea of any kind of indivisible security disappeared entirely. So when you ask what is the security for Europe now, Europe needs a security arrangement not based on blocs, but Europe can't get its head around that. And by the way, Europe has made this mistake so many times. There's a kind of bloody-mindedness in Europe. I'm just rereading the history of Poland refusing to form a common security agreement with the Soviet Union in 1939, even as Nazi Germany was about to destroy Poland. But Poland hated the Russians so much that it wouldn't even look to the Soviet Union for protection in 1939. If you look back at that, it's completely suicidal. And Europe is just a difficult place. Everybody hates each other. And so they can't imagine collective security. They can't imagine indivisible security. Now, what do I recommend for this? I recommend that the Europeans have direct diplomacy with Russia. I recommend, by the way, that you don't put European security literally in the hands of a few Baltic state politicians. This is to put Europe's politics into the hands of the most rabidly Russophobic people on the whole continent. But if Europe maintains its Russophobia, there is no security for Europe. And if Europe doesn't engage in diplomacy, there's no peace for Europe, whatever the United States does. So when you ask me what's the European security arrangement, it would be that Europeans understand Russia's not going anywhere. Russia is a part of Europe, and it has been geographically. It is a part of Europe, to the Urals at least, and militarily, culturally, diplomatically, geopolitically, financially, economically, it is. And if the Europeans think the United States is going to somehow make that not happen, well, that was the idea of the Cold War, but that's past. So if Europe is looking to the United States to replay the Cold War, forget it. The U.S. is tired. It's got huge budget deficits. Russia is not viewed as some, even it was wrongly viewed then, but it's not viewed as some global communist threat. The United States is just not interested in the European hatreds. And so they should talk to the Russians and figure out what their indivisible security really is about.
Yeah, we actually signed the agreements in 1990, the Charter of Paris for a New Europe. This was supposed to be the structure for post-Cold War Europe. And as you said, two of the key themes was indivisible security. So we should not enhance our security at the expense of the other side. And of course, no dividing lines. This was, overcoming bloc politics. This, in the spirit of a common European home, this was the idea. But no, it's all gone now, though. And as you said, with the Baltic states, the Russophobia there now essentially becoming the official policy of the EU is quite extraordinary. But we had Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy chief, making this speech where she was arguing that how wonderful it would be if Russia's defeated, because then if there's many smaller countries, they would be much more peaceful. So this is peace now, expanding a military bloc and balkanizing your opponent. I mean, it's a very far cry away from the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, but just
And it is so painful for me because having been part of Gorbachev's economic strategy group in 1990, having proposed helping the economic transformation from the failed Soviet system to a functional system, and having that turned down by the West, I watched all of that. I sat across from Boris Yeltsin in December 1991 when he told our small group that the Soviet Union was over and that he wanted peace and cooperation with the West to be, for Russia to be just a normal country alongside the rest of Europe. And with, with Kaja Kallas, I advised her father, who was the governor of the Central Bank of Estonia in 1992. I helped Estonia design its central bank and its currency. They gave me a high prize for that, actually, a national award for my contribution to that. And she won't even talk to me. They don't want to talk. They just want more. It's crazy. So self-defeating, but not for the first time in Europe, I'm sorry to say.
Well, that's just my last quick question. Do you see this as when the European leaders say that Russia's planning to attack, once they're done with Ukraine, they will come for us. This is why we have to fight them now. Do they actually believe this, or this posturing, or given that you have engaged with these people, well, most of the ones who are there in power now, what is your impression? Because on one hand, they do have to, if they want to keep the war going a bit longer, they have to kind of sell these narratives. But at times, one get the impression that they might actually believe the stuff they're spinning as well. So it's very hard, to tell, because at some points they have said the exact opposite. They recognize that creating a Europe without Russia would unavoidably become Europe against Russia. I think Angela Merkel once made this comment. So do they believe this,
Yes.
or is it just
And,
posturing?
and Angela Merkel said about the 2008 Bucharest NATO meeting that she knew that if they pushed this roadmap for Ukrainian membership in NATO, this was going to be war. She said that. So they knew that. So I think with the European leaders, it's complicated. First, many of them know, but maybe they have forgotten. Maybe they've talked themselves into a frenzy. And let's remember, they're completely unpopular. So whatever they're saying, they're not carrying their publics with them at all. So I would say that the most important points are two. First, the publics don't believe it. And second, the Europeans, if they do believe it, the first thing that I would do if I actually believe that would be to sit down with the Russian counterparts and say, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? What can you tell us about guarantees for us? If we guarantee your security by stopping NATO enlargement, what about our security? That's a conversation to have. That's a good question to ask Foreign Minister Lavrov. Fair enough. But they don't even ask the question. They just claim to presume the answer. That is a self-fulfilling path to war. So the point is that if they really believe this, either they're suicidal or homicidal for their own populations, or they're so stupid that they don't understand that if you believe that, you better sit down with your counterparts and try to figure out a way that it doesn't come to pass, because there are things you can do in diplomacy, agreements you can reach, neutrality zones and buffer zones and monitoring and commitments that can matter. And they don't even try to explore those. So again, I've said to the European friends that I know, what are you doing? Go talk with your counterparts. Then you can make decisions not based on your prejudices or your claims or your phony domestic politics or your delusions, whatever it is, but at least on the basis of some facts that you can discern. But the truth is, European diplomacy is not so impressive in history. The tendency to war is extraordinary. The failure to talk is absolutely extraordinary. And even when there is a real risk, they don't even know how to get around to face the risk in a realistic way. So, yeah, if Kaja Kallas doesn't want to speak with the Russians, choose a different uh, external affairs representative for Europe, but go talk and go someplace. Go to Abu Dhabi. Go to Istanbul. Invite a counterpart to Brussels. Go to Moscow. But come on, stop just saying that we're going to war.